you all.
And thank you, Victor.
Thank you.
So Agostino will present us a presentation entitled Transformative Policies for the European Green Deal in a post-COVID-19 reality for a sustainable, resilient and prosperous Europe. It's a big challenge, Agostino, that you decided to take, but we are looking forward hearing your presentation. So
thank you.
You can share your screen and yeah.
Yes, I'll do so now. Thank you, Silvia. Thank you to Victor. It was a fantastic talk. So, sure. Just to say that, of course, I'm with colleagues. We are reflecting, well, quite deeply, given the circumstances, on what all of this, our current circumstances, mean for the various policies. And the policy I work on is the European Green Deal. And obviously, these are my visions, right? So I'm not talking for any institutional voice here. So thank you, Silvia, for organizing this, and thank you for everyone that's participating to be here with us today. So this question of the European Green Deal, I'd like to start maybe just giving a super quick overview of what is the Green Deal place in the vision for the next European Commission. So, well, as you know, from the elections in last May, we have a new commission that took office in November 2019. It was slightly delayed by, different political circumstances that at the time seemed like big deals. Now probably no one remembers them. So the whole idea, in fact, about this Ursula von der Leyen Commission compared to the previous commission, the one by Jean-Claude Juncker, was essentially this idea that after could you reduce the camera on your screen?
Yes, can you hear me, Agostino? Sorry, just think
yes.
We have an issue between the connection on your laptop and the application. Could you just reduce as minimal as possible the other window?
Yeah, sorry, I'll cut it.
Yeah, because it
sorry, I didn't realize.
Create like lessons.
Yeah, perfect. So essentially, the new commission at the beginning said that it was different from the previous one because while the Juncker Commission was considered to be a commission that was very much reacting to crisis, right? So the aftermath of the financial crisis with the Eurozone crisis in Europe, the migration crisis, and so forth. Von der Leyen Commission ambition at the beginning was to be a very strategic commission as it was defined in the political guidelines. So a commission that essentially could set very clear directions in front of it. And to frame these very clear directions, the president decided to frame the ambition of its agenda in 6 different goals that you see on these slides. And the first priority was a European Green Deal, then a Europe fit for the digital age, a stronger Europe in the world. So this is this idea of having a geopolitical commission that was very commented about, an economy that works for people, completing the internal market and beyond, promoting our European way of life. If you remember, this goal at the beginning was called protecting, and then he had all sort of discussions about this. And then a new push for European democracy, which essentially was this idea of having a conference on the future of Europe of the duration of 2 years starting this May. Obviously, also this has been postponed. Now, what happened, of course, is that, when you're busy sort of making plans, life happens, right? So essentially, just after 100 days of this commission, in fact, crisis struck in full mode. And, we did also this idea that this commission was very different and it was going to be like a strategic one and not a reactive one, changed, right? Because now we are in the midst of, the biggest crisis that Europe has faced, definitely the European Union has faced throughout its existence, and the Europe as overall has faced probably after the Second World War. Now, in any case, the commitment to the agenda, it's obviously still there, and the first priority of the agenda, sorry, it doesn't go. Okay, was this European Green Deal, and the European Green Deal idea was essentially to frame a set of like very bold ambitions, very bold transformative policies that would get us to what Victor was talking about before, right? So this idea of getting into a carbon neutral future, carbon neutral economy by 2050, right? So essentially the question is, okay, this is the destination, 2050 carbon neutral, and in any case, following the Paris agreements. And then everything else was essentially how to turn this ambition in a transformation for the whole of Europe, right? And crucially, for industries and so forth, this European Green Deal was also framed as a new growth strategy, right? So to grow differently and so forth. So we just heard Victor discussing a little bit in the report, decoupling debunked, what the challenges in these are, but nonetheless, this was the ambition, right? So to try through this process to keep growing in a sustainable manner and whatnot. Given the fact that this was the first priority of the Commission, we started to work quite hard from the beginning on this. So already on the 11th of December of last year, there was a communication on the Green New Deal that was adopted. And then this communication framed the different goals to be reached during the first year. And for instance, already in March, there was the adoption of the climate law, right? So the new climate law, which essentially committed Europe as a continent to become climate neutral by 2050. And in the pipeline, we had numerous other political initiatives that you see in this slide summarized, but essentially you see climate pact and climate law on the top of the slide. So this was adopted, and we also adopted the new circular economy strategy, and other strategies instead were sort of blocked throughout blocked by this or postponed by the circumstances of the COVID-19. So the farm to fork strategy, for instance, that aimed to transform food systems in Europe, and the new industrial strategies and so forth, and the biodiversity strategy, all of these have been slowed down in terms of policy making. Now, the big question, of course, now is what this whole situation means for the implementation of the Green Deal. And the big question, of course, is whether this will stay as the main policy, aim of this Commission, or if it will be replaced by dealing with the current crisis and with the aftermath of the crisis. Now, here top left, we see Frans Timmermans. Frans Timmermans is the vice president, one of the executive vice presidents of the European Commission, and is the one that received the mandate to implement the Green Deal. So, and he's also the commissioner for DG Clima. So it's the person that is going to deliver the European Green Deal if the European Green Deal is going to be delivered. Now, some MEPs and some prime ministers and presidents around Europe have said that given the fact that the European Green Deal is going to cost a lot to be implemented, we should forget about it for the time, because essentially we should focus on growth, on policies that are going to deliver growth and jobs, no matter the environmental costs, and that essentially the environment or green transition is is somewhat a luxury, right? So you've all heard this type of argument, but it's fair to say, and it's definitely, at least for the moment, what's happening at the European Union level, that this is not the way in which the situation has been approached by our hierarchy. And in fact, there is very much a commitment to the fact that this Green Deal should stay as the compass to guide us outside the crisis phase. But still, of course, there are challenges. We have seen how the tensions between member states due to the different impact of the virus, and also due to like different ideas on how to deal with the virus, have already demonstrated or a sort of risk, right, on tearing apart the European Union here. So what I would say now is that essentially, this is my view and the view of certain colleagues, or of many colleagues, is that if anything, this crisis demonstrates the need to perhaps move faster on the Green Deal, because essentially what this COVID crisis demonstrated is a crisis in a sense, is a crisis of not being prepared, right? So it's a crisis of our society not be resilient, like robust in the face of this crisis. And so the argument that we make is that instead of using this circumstance only to try and bounce back to our pre-crisis conditions, we should indeed try to bounce forward with the COVID crisis. And obviously the crisis and the impact of the crisis is terrible, and at the social and economic level, the damages will be extremely long-lasting. And I'm quite positive that these damages, in the medium term, at least, can make even very big environmental damage as we try to go back to where we were. Of course, we all seen the pictures of foxes and porcupines and coming back to the cities, and octopus in the Venice Lagoon and so forth. But this is of course some short-term gain that then we'll risk losing in the recovery. And so the argument here is that essentially, because this is a crisis of resilience or preparedness of our society, well, indeed, now we should focus on getting out of this crisis, but also keep building resilience for the next crisis to come. And as the previous speaker has so clearly stated, climate change and environmental degradation is not a crisis in the future, right? So it's a crisis that everyone, or most people, are already living with effects of, right? So before, for instance, the COVID crisis took all the news, of course, we were talking about, an exceptionally dry year that was menacing to destroy a lot of agricultural production, and of course, not only in Europe, but also in Europe. So what we can discuss in a few minutes when we go back to a Q&A session is indeed this question, right? So what should we do? What will happen, right? So a return to business as usual, some type of normality with lessons learned, right? So maybe, we go back to normal, we go back to work, but then maybe we do a few less meeting in person. We can do a lot more teleconferences like today, because effectively it's 90% as effective as a conference in person, and so forth. Or whether this is going to be really the dawn of a radically different reality, right? So something that changes completely the status quo, and for that you only have to to read the opinion pieces of the largest media around the world, right? So whether this is going to spell the end of capitalism, or this is going to spell the end of democracy, and so forth. Of course, there are risks and opportunities, and in fact, it's fair to say that probably this crisis will accelerate certain trends that were already going on, right? So for instance, a switch to telework or a switch to digitalization will probably be enhanced by this. So we all seen the, Amazon reported returns during this crisis, right? So perhaps a faster shift to online shopping and so forth. And then there are other things that instead could, are at the moment quite unpredictable, and they will depend massively from what we decide to do, right? So there is a question of deglobalization, right? So our supply chains have demonstrated to be quite weak in the face of the pandemic, right? So there is a lot of disruption in the economy, also because the economy is dispersed, the production of the goods is dispersed at the global level, and this is demonstrated to be quite vulnerable. And so there is an idea of possible relocalization of production in Europe and elsewhere. Then there is a big question about what will be the role of the state in the aftermath of this, right? So for sure, we will have a state that purchases a lot more, bigger chunks of the economy. What does that mean in terms of market economy? And also, we have a state that essentially is overnight taking decisions that are, of course, quite disruptive on the lives of everyone. So there is a question whether this will lead to a more autocratic state, for instance, or whether this will link to a more democratic state, right? Because people will re-engage with decision-making processes, seeing how important these are. And of course, other issues that I think are extremely important, which is more of a question of at the ethical level, right? So whether this will bring, a boom in solidarity, or whether instead will go towards a sort of like home alone hyper-individualism, right? So all of these things, are issues that we should reflect upon. And on society, I said a few of these things already, right? So health is a new status symbol, right? So the value of being able to guarantee your health. We've seen, for instance, how at the beginning, also in France, I was looking at the data. At the beginning was the cadre, the middle management from companies and so forth that was getting infected because of business troubles and so forth. But then after that, it's a little bit like, all the office workers and, so to speak, have been isolated in our ivory towers at home. But there are still a lot of people that they're going around doing the job that they need to do for us to be able to afford this, and perhaps getting infected in the meantime. Right? So this has highlighted some dimensions of inequality that is really crucial. On the EU, as I was saying briefly during the introduction, well, first of all, you see a lot of the fact that indeed most of the tools to respond to the immediate crisis are tools that still are at the member states level, right? So hospitals, armies, police, the capacity to lock people in, all of this happens at the member state level. And also, I would say a lot of the bad showing of Europe at the beginning, right? With, for instance, the face masks being blocked in different member states and not going smoothly to the member states that needed them the most and so forth. Well, all of this, of course, was because of national decisions. And then instead, I would say that there is a possibility of a stronger EU solidarity, right? And at the time, I guess we are in the middle between these two opportunities, but I think we've seen a little bit of both, right? Of course, we always need to reflect when we think about, massive changes ahead and so forth, about the fact that, many times before we witnessed things that we started saying, okay, this is going to change absolutely everything, right? So when we talk about the dematerialization of work and working remotely, it's already something that we started discussing in the 1980s. This idea that paper was doomed was already something that we discussed in the 1970s and so forth, right? So and of course, I also would like to say something about the ways in which we speak about these circumstances, right? So for instance, now everywhere in the news you see these questions about whether this is a new Marshall Plan. We need a new Marshall Plan and so forth. But then when you look at the resources that we want to put in place, these don't match, right? What the Marshall Plan idea was. So in a sense, keep the distance between this immediate crisis and saying that this is going to change everything, and other crises in the past that also perhaps we thought would change everything. Now, it's fair to say that the longer this situation lasts, the more I am at least personally convinced that a lot of things will change, right? So because there will be some readjustment that then it becomes difficult to go back to. So Ursula von der Leyen defined this Green Deal as the Europe Man on the Moon moment, right? So a big mission for the EU. And now we are here, like this comes from The Economist, in this vision, right? That we're essentially now fighting against this virus. And in a sense, this is a dress rehearsal for what climate change would do, right? And you can see why, because this is a global problem, is a global shock, but we're responding to it slightly separately. And of course, there are a lot of other similarities if you want to find them, right? So for instance, there is a question of climate justice and environmental justice, right? So we know how climate change is going to hit disproportionately communities that are already worse off from many other indicators. And in fact, coronavirus, it's hitting communities that are already worse off, for instance, for access to healthcare, or maybe because they need to go to work and support. So there are a few ideas there that show that the situations are comparable. Now, we reflected internally on a few ideas of what this could mean on the various chapters for the Green New Deal. On energy, well, if you were already online when the previous speaker was talking, I think he said a lot about what the consequences could be. But so essentially the biggest consequences is that, especially with the oil prices that we're witnessing now, probably this will be a big hit for the renewable energy market. And of course, in a situation where the member states start to be cash strapped, right? So they have a lot of other priorities. There is a possibility that there will be a cut in different subsidies and in different frameworks, also against renewable energy. On the other end, there is this idea that, considering the shock, it would be smart to reorient towards energy structures that are more resilient to shocks. And so this could mean much more investment by public actors, also in securing this. Then we reflected on the issue of industry, right? So honestly, from the industrial perspective, I don't see many opportunities. I think that essentially there is a big threat, which is, of course, that most of the companies will have to radically cut their investment plans. So this also means investment in research and innovation, and this also means investment in a green transition. And whether we can keep the center lane or not on this will depend, again, on essentially the way in which states will support the industry through this difficulty, right? So this could be a moment, of course, to make a push towards cleaner technologies and so forth. So for instance, in the case of the 2007 recessions, it's well known that the Obama administration, in bailing out the automotive industry, was quite strict in certain environmental protection regulations attached to the loans. On mobility, essentially the question is, again, this was covered before, but the airlines are, of course, in terrible shape, and there is a big impact also on the automotive industry. Now, the opportunities again are for the governments to drive some decarbonization through the bailing out process, and then also this possibility that teleworking can replace the daily commute. On the other end, of course, now that the economies start slowly to reopen, we see how there is a lot of fear, for instance, in using public transportation methods, right? So this can also push all us back to individual ownership. We don't know. On farm to fork, which is one of the priorities that we've seen, there is a question of the breakdown of supply chains, and perhaps also risk of food scarcity in certain countries in the world. On the other end, we see the opportunities of relocalizing some of the food production, perhaps in a less environmentally impactful way, and perhaps also the possibility of using this as a driver in jobs. This is something that we'll definitely need. On ecosystem and biodiversity, there is, as we've seen, for instance, in the response by the US, this risk of relaxing environmental regulations, because they're seen as a sort of red tape stopping growth. But on the other end, I think it's pretty clear by now how there is this very strong link between, say, environmental degradations and the impact of COVID, both in terms of how this disease started, right, with this spillover effect between species, which happens more likely with deforestation and so forth, and also and how people are differently affected, right? So now this is not yet something that we know for sure, but it looks to be at least a very strong correlation between environmental pollution in air pollution, and mortality rates for this disease, which is something that is very important. And yeah, so Silvia, I think you asked me for 20 minutes, and I think I can take questions whenever you like.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone, for listening in.
Thanks so much, Agostino. We had 160 participants looking at your talk from our YouTube channel, so we are very happy of all the insights that you could give about what's happening at the European level. And so while you're speaking, it seems that you don't have a clear, you don't want to give a clear direction, obviously, because it's all very uncertain towards the idea of whether this is going to be a threat or an opportunity. So basically everything is out there, and we just need to take all this complexity into account. And obviously we hope that we can take the opportunities which as better as we can. So there was this one question that in terms of indeed being able to catch this opportunity to be better in the future, what can we learn from how countries collaborated in facing this crisis at the European level? So what can the EU do to make the next crisis better from this point of view?
Absolutely. Okay. So thank you, Silvia. Thank you for the listeners, whoever asked the question. Is very good. So first of all, I don't think that the glass is half full or half empty, right? That there will be opportunities and there will be setbacks. I think what's happening, it's clear that in terms of sustainable development is a terrible shock. And I think will push us back in terms of, how sustainable our societies are, especially if you consider that the UN Sustainable Development Goals have a very strong focus, of course, on the social dimension of development and so forth. So on all of that, this is a disaster, right? Because of course so we have to be very clear about this also, because in terms of opportunities, right, the fact that the countries that are being hit by this will get out of this with a much larger burden of debt on their shoulder, means that this will reduce the opportunities. On the other end, as you said, in anything this big, there must be different sides. And so the question is, how to get there. Now, I was talking to Enrico Giovannini, who is an expert on sustainable development. He's an Italian expert, but it's quite well known I suppose all over Europe. And at the time of the 2008 crisis, he was a chief statistician at the OECD, and he was very frank. And he said that at the time that this happened, they were really progressing quite rapidly towards the post-GDP accounting reflection. And then essentially the 2007 financial crisis put everything on hold, right? So it was very clear in saying that in that case, that crisis was very bad for sustainable development. But indeed, that crisis prepared us better in terms of European response. So we shouldn't, it's easy, and I'm the first one to say, we should have seen this coming, we should have been better prepared. But then if you think about the ways in which, say, financially, the European Union was capable to respond to this, well, I think we benefited from the 2010 Euro crisis, right? So the famous whatever it takes talk by Mario Draghi, the then president of the European Central Bank, came 2 years after the pain started in Europe, right? From the aftermath of the financial crisis. If you think about this now, it took a matter of days, a matter of weeks to agree on something that before the financial crisis would be unprecedented, right? So the suspension of the Stability Pact and, a program of quantitative easing and so forth. So I think from that perspective, we can say that we responded quickly to this, a bit more quickly to this crisis, because we had that knowledge behind. In terms of what we can do better, what we can do better at the political level. Well, I think it's all a question of, for instance, in terms of, there is a need for coherent healthcare responses across Europe. Yes. If you see what happens at the beginning of this crisis, the response is a clear yes. But all of this essentially goes back to the fundamental questions, right? So whether we want deeper integration or not deeper integration. And this is a political question. Personally, I can give you a personal answer. I think that there will be more integration, because essentially, and it's going to be a bit forced on people, because essentially, yesterday I was listening. I'm in Italy in this lockdown, and I was listening to the evening news, and there was a lot of talk, of course, of the Europeans are not doing this, are not doing that. But then, whatever we ask Europe as such to contribute will unavoidably need more integration, right? Because of course, also in terms of risk sharing, monetary burden sharing, and so forth, this will also need more integration at the political level. So I think we'll get there, not through this crisis necessarily, but this crisis will accelerate that.
Thanks. And again, we're running a bit late, but I think
sorry.
It's our fault. It's not your fault. But there are some interesting questions that I think is still worth asking. So, because you were talking of integration, and obviously integration can be across states, but someone is making the point that integration is also across generations. And obviously, European institutions for many citizens are something which might feel a bit far away, and especially from the young professional perspective. So since, given our audience here, how is Europe speaking to these persons? And we know that there are youth movements that are trying to make this link, but how do you see this playing a role in?
Well, I can first give you like a response again at the personal level. So I was teaching, I helped teaching this Master in Sustainable Development in Milano. And we had the lecture last week, and essentially all of the questions were exactly about this, right? What's going to be with sustainable development in the economy after this? But the question itself, what's going to be with me, right? Because I'm the person doing a master in sustainable development, right? So my eggs are in this basket, and now I fear that this basket is being thrown out of the window and so forth. And this resonated with me, right? Because I'm 34, so essentially I was coming out of university and into the job market and so forth at the time of the other crisis. And for a lot of people, this was back to the drawing board, right? So this was, okay, I wanted to get the job at, maybe Deloitte or, in other firms and so forth. And then all of a sudden, these firms, weren't hiring anymore, or they were canceling hires and so forth. And I think that this was a big shock, but also this is a great moment for personal reflections on behalf of the students and on behalf of the younger generations, because really this is also one of those moments where essentially you don't sleepwalk into whatever job you thought was the most obvious for you to take, because this is a situation that is going to like change dramatically, right? What is the safe bet in terms of perspectives. On the question of, and by the way, I do think that this climate crisis is so much larger and so much more important, to be honest, than what we are experiencing now, that, it's still a safe bet to say I'm going to be in this space, right? And as Victor so clearly said, that at one point, the physical constraints will overcome even the fiscal and financial constraints, right? So what we think, it's the economy, it's not something that you can mess with, because that's how the economy works. I remember Tony Blair, I'm that old, but I remember Tony Blair talking about wanting to empty the sea with a spoon, right? When someone questioned whether globalization should be, like somehow regulated or not. These things, in a matter of a few years, in fact, if you think about, in a matter of maybe 13 years, I would say, since that speech, 14, now things look already radically different, right? In terms of intragenerational solidarity and so forth, this is a very big question. I think especially at the beginning of the question, especially in some countries, there was a feeling that in responding to these, we were prioritizing, certain generations to protect their health and maybe like sabotaging the economic possibilities of other generations. I think, to be honest, though, that now with how big this thing has become, how predominant this thing has become, I think we are all in it together. So we better like start with an idea of solidarity between generations more than anything.
And really a last one, and then we'll have to move on to the next speaker. But because we talked about states, we talked about generation, then another question is about where these supports, towards whom these fiscal supports go. So if I read the question, it would be, can you see ways in which fiscal union and aggressive monetary policy could help finance the Green Deal, or are we still looking mostly at raising more debt? And clearly this would have other implications, but ultimately it's a decision around who bears the bulk of the cost. So whether financial investors or citizens. So again, maybe a big question for the last 5 minutes, but what's your take on this?
No, my take, I remember a talk some time ago, right, when, someone at Potocnik, the former European Commissioner, was talking about, how in his lifetime he's seen population growing by 50%, and he would exclude the population would be again growing by 50% and so forth, right? So I think at some point, given the fact that the planet is limited, we hit a point of no return, right? So, and in terms of big investment programs by governments, right? So if you take the US, because in the US you always have this sort of like, it's almost like things happen a little bit more quickly, right? Because essentially it's obviously a much more complete federal state and so forth. I'm not saying that this is the right response, but then what you see is that overnight, what was considered unthinkable to spend, right? So say, healthcare for all, it's unthinkable to spend, a trillion in this. Well, overnight, there is a stimulus package of 2 trillions and things like that. Now, I think that at least in Europe, we have to be extremely careful about how we spend this money, because it's not possible that we have the money now to like try and re-emerge from this crisis, and then down the line we will find the money to like re-emerge from the next crisis, right, which would be the climate crisis and would be like later down the line and so forth. So to be honest, I think that even though it's difficult to imagine this is exactly what we have to do, right? We have to think about the stimulus money that will come from this crisis also as an opportunity to restructure our economy or accelerate our economy towards a more sustainable path, which then links directly, Silvia, to your question about who's going to pay and who's going to bear the costs in the future. Because of course, this is different whether you're going to give, like money to small and medium enterprises that are going to like trying to readapt, and workers that they need to reskill and so forth, or whether you're going to like give bailouts to big companies or the financial sector and so forth to like keep things in place. Yeah. There is a question which I think is the same question that we had with the other crisis, that is much easier to give money to like large operators. Like for instance, in Italy now, there is a scheme of 600 euros to every household or every worker that is currently unemployed, but it's incredibly difficult, right, to distribute these, to target these and so forth. And so it's much easier to say, okay, I'm going to bail out, the 5 biggest employers in the country. But the situation is so complex that, the response will have to be difficult. So I think that the states and so forth will also have to reach more maturity from this point of view, right? So more targeted fiscal stimulus for the transition. And for who's going to pay, I'm a little bit with Victor, right? I think once you start, the whole story, right? If I owe you 5 euros, I have a problem. But if you owe me 1 billion euros, you have a problem. So I think once that this public debts will start to get closer to 200% of GDP, not that many people will ask to be repaid, but that's a guess I have.
All right, thanks so much. I think even though we have still questions for you and we would not stop, I think we need to stop.
Yeah, people can